that webinar chat box there, and we're going to be, as we always do in our webinars, is we're going to be using the chat box, we're going to be using the screen, and we're going to be helping us have this conversation so it's not just Peggy talking. So Colorado Springs, I'm sorry, I just saw that pop up. Rachel, I am, oh, it says Colorado. Well, I love Colorado Springs, so I am super excited to see somebody else from Colorado here online with us. So today is virtual chapters and online communities. Should we or shouldn't we? And we're going to have a vibrant conversation today about this whole conversation around what is a virtual chapter, and is it something that we ought to be spending some time focusing on? So this is, of course, brought to you by your wonderful hosts, Bill Highway and Mariner. Bill Highway is the lovely group right behind the Zoom box there. You will see third from the left there, Sarah is running our program today, and she's probably in a room with the other three watching diligently and listening in, and we'll chime in with ideas and thoughts. Now, they got lots of ideas and thoughts about how we can really activate our chapters, and they've got a great knowledge bank on their website if you haven't already checked that, because there's some really cool resources there. And then, of course, I'm hailing from Mariner, and my my business partner, Peter, who's also shown there. He's in the background and for this webinar, but we are delighted to be here. Now, one of the things you need to know is that Bill Highway and Mariner partnered on a set of workshops on this very topic. And so part of what we're going to be sharing today is not only information that we learned and gleaned by talking to lots of organizations, but also then what came out of those two workshops, two vibrant conversations in April, one in Chicago, one in Washington, D.C. area. So our purpose for all of these is, and will continue to be, to build the community and to connect component-based organizations, and most importantly, the folks of you on this call, to connect all of us to be able to continue a conversation and be able to determine what are some resources, what are some tools, what are some shared ideas. It's going to be, it's the learning, and that's the reason why I said get the chat box and get your fingers warmed up, because this really is a sharing opportunity. What I want to know is, you know, we've got a lot of slides here and we've got some ideas, but this has got to be your learning opportunity. So in the chat box, tell us what you need to get out of this conversation. You know, what kind of brings you here? So were you excited about this notion of, can I figure out a virtual chapter? Were you excited about this idea of how do I marry the online community to the on-the-ground chapter? So go ahead and tell us what brings you this conversation and what do you need to get out of it by the time that we are done. Thank you, Jennifer, for chiming in first and foremost. Yes. Interested in creating divisions and chapters. Well, okay, cool, very good. That's a broad conversation. Yes, comes up with the virtual chapter from Jana. So keep, do me a favor, keep putting in those chats while I go ahead and launch our first poll. So tell us, do you currently have, or are you considering virtual chapters? So you might say, I have a chapter. You might say, I'm considering, I had. Now, if you said had, please tell us in the chat why that's past tense. If you say have, tell us in the chat a little bit about what you're doing with it. What are your, you know, what size, shape is it? What online community are you using? You know, tell us a little bit more about it. And of course, if you're typing in other for me, go ahead and share that as well. So let me give a few more moments for people to figure out where the poll buttons are, find your mouse, and log in. Now, Melissa, that's an interesting comment. I think we probably want to hear more about launching a patient platform. You said as part of a new initiative. So tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe we'll have some more conversation around this. Great. Wow, Karen, you have 30,000. Oh, I'm sorry. You better 30,000 members. You only have 1% engagement. Interesting. Yeah. Really cool piece I just saw on the Higher Logic blog post. It was about the role of online communities and is it the 90 the 80-10-10 rule. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was understanding that that in an online community we do have a situation where you have to bring folks in. You gotta breadcrumb pull them in. But that actually we're seeing some increased engagement on the online community platform. And one of the, and I'm looking for some cool stats that I pulled off in anticipation of this call. One of the stats that came out of their research, here it is that we ought to be looking at the 70-20-10 rule, that you should have 10% of your folks are in the creator mode, 20% are in the commenter mode, and 70% are lurkers. So you're always going to have lurkers. I think that is perhaps a rule of thought that we should be able to take a look at. Okay. Oh, and if you are raising your hand, thank you, Bill Highway, for saying, if you're raising your hand, if you can type it in, that would be the fastest and cleanest way for us, but we will get to some of those calls as well. Let me show you what you got. We have 84% of the folks are currently considering. You've got 12% of you have one. None of you have tried this and it closed it down yet. And you've got a couple of other folks. So with the sharing, let's go ahead and get into our meat of our conversation. All right. So as we are looking at this conversation, it would be very useful for us to know, are your chapters offering any virtual offerings that supplement their activity? So let me pull that poll up for you real quickly. So what I'm trying to find out here as you are answering this, because this is all part of the technology that we have to embed in the virtual chapter, if that's the way to go. So talk to us a little bit about here. Are your chapters offering any of these virtual offerings? So that are they creating their own webinars? Are they using your webinars? Are they live streaming events? Are they bringing in virtual speakers? Maybe they're doing podcasts. Maybe they have a regular tweet chat. Some of them may have an online platform that you host. Others may have one that they created. So share with us a little bit about what your chapters are doing. And while you're doing that, I will mention that, so many of you know that Mariner is an association management company, and we manage 3 organizations that are local organizations. 2 are chapters of other organizations. And recently, in one of our groups, we had a one-day conference, and we had a speaker we really wanted who couldn't attend, and we brought them in virtually via Zoom. It worked extremely well, and it allowed us to bring a voice into the conversation that we wouldn't have had. So there are some really cool opportunities about how you embed the technology, you create those virtual offerings. So let me end the poll and share what I've got here. This is pretty cool. So 50% of you have an online community that you're allowing chapters to use. Go ahead and tell us which communities you're using. I really like the fact that I saw the virtual speakers, the podcasts are 2 really good things. Share with us a little bit about those as well, because I think that those are some of the ways that we can integrate technology into our organizations or our chapters. All right. So before we did our workshop, we went out to the community and we asked, whose chapters have virtual offerings, and we also asked how many of you virtual. So I'm going to show you these 2 slides because you just answered in your own chapters, and here you can see that there are a fair number of folks where chapters are creating webinars, and there were some comments around the fact that the national can supply, or sometimes the chapters have to find their own technology. But the question that we beg is that, If the chapter is going to create webinars or they're going to provide access to the national, how are you still embedding the face-to-face communications on those groups? The second thing is we did ask how many of you have chapters, and as you can see, that of the vast majority, or the greater majority, they have not had any chapters gone virtual. But it was interesting because we're seeing this, we're seeing more folks beginning to shift into and creating virtual chapters, which is, of course, why we're here to talk today, right? Okay, on our agenda, why? Some real life stories, look at the what chapters, what virtual chapters are, and then some key questions. Why do we want virtual? I think that we need to identify what is the issue, what is the interest that we're trying to explore here, to solve here with the virtual chapter. And in doing that, then we can figure out the structure of such a chapter. In our discussions, both with folks that had chapters, were considering chapters, we found out that there's actually 3 categories of the why. There's the first question around that we need a virtual community that is helping members in a shared geographic territory, the same town, the same city, the same state, because they've got some shared local issues and they want to be able to get together in a way that doesn't require them to have a traditional chapter. The second, though, was culture. It was around really the geographic culture as opposed to geographic land or property or acreage, right? So the one we've seen over and over again is military. So you do a virtual chapter for everybody that's in the military. Another organization said that because they have a cadre of folks that work inside hospitals versus their members that work outside hospitals, and hospitals are fairly unique, they found that they wanted a virtual chapter for folks that were operating in the hospital setting. And the third was really this notion of a virtual chapter formed to provide a solution for members that didn't have a traditional chapter. So in other words, if you look at these 3 categories, I think the most interesting thing about this is that 2 and 3, okay, the culture and the non-traditional, they really look a lot like or parallel our specialty interest groups or our online community. So the name chapter seems to be used here really in an effort to help members feel parity, to help members feel like, well, I don't have a geographic chapter, but I've got a chapter. So that the name becomes really more about community than it does the chapter. But it does then, when you do that, it does bring in some additional issues. So is that a good use of the word virtual chapter? I don't know, and no judgment here, quite frankly. But I will say that as we are talking about virtual chapters, I think we have to have a working definition so that we can be clearer about the hows and the whats. And so I offer up to you, based on the stuff that we've been doing, that a working definition of the chapter is an alternative model formed around geography for the purpose of building a local community. And therefore, it'll be addressing those shared local related issues. Could be regulatory, legislative. It could be something about the culture or the nature or the makeup of that community. The reason why I bring this to our attention is because if it is a more generic and it's really about a culture and it's really about perhaps even just that, well, folks don't have a chapter in their area, but they're coming from a diverse group, it's going to mirror and potentially compete against your online community. So we have to have some clarity around what's going to drive this virtual chapter. When we talked to people, we found out that what was struggling in the traditional chapter were these elements that I just put up here. And I think that it's really important for us to understand how many of these driving needs and questions the virtual is going to actually fix. So for example, if there is a waning volunteerism, it's not going to fix that, because what we're going to find in just a few moments is the virtual chapter needs volunteers. A different volunteer, yes, maybe the waning volunteerism is actually just a reaction to the type of volunteering. If a chapter is struggling on the ground, simply taking it to virtual is not going to stop the struggle. So it is true, though, that if there's time challenges to attend a local event, it potentially, a hybrid event, or excuse me, a virtual event could make a difference. But as we already saw, some of your chapters can do that part of it, bring that virtual aspect in it without giving up the feet on the street, that, you know, the on the ground thing. If it's increasing demand for virtual education and networking, let's pause for just a moment and go ahead and jump on the chat on this. Isn't that competing with your virtual education and your virtual networking? A thought. Let's keep this in the back of our minds as we talk about and consider whether or not the virtual chapter is going to make a difference for us. At the bottom line, I would suggest that what we really have is an ecosystem, and the ecosystem has to have all of these parts. And it's not so much that one replaces the other, as that by adding and just building out these options, what you're doing is building out options for your people to find the community that's going to make the difference. It may be an on-the-ground chapter. It could be that special interest group or group formed by discipline. It could be that online beautiful community, and it could even be an online community that has some, you know, some parts to it. And it could be this local group that meets entirely virtually. But we need all of these. And the more I've talked to folks and the more we've looked at the metrics, one size doesn't fit all. So the ability for us to consider this as what's going to make a difference. So I suggest as we go forward that the chapters formed around geography and traditionally is about face-to-face. The SIG, the COP, whatever you call them, is around issue, interest, discipline. It's about sharing. It's about knowledge management. It's about collaboration. Oftentimes, we in associations charge them with owning and developing the content for a specific sector. The community is this awesome virtual peer-to-peer help desk, and the virtual chapter is formed around the community. So, put your thoughts in the chat box. Let's talk a little bit about you know, those definitions and how they fit where you're going. And as we do, what I'd love to do is to ask you the next most important question, I think, which is, regardless of whether or not you think the online community can do it, you think the hybrid chapter can do it, you think the virtual chapter, the question is, you have to start with, what does success look like? Because if we're going to build something, we have to know what success looks like. So let me have you jump in on poll number 3. How would you track success? So let's just say we say, yeah, let's try this virtual chapter. There is some need for us to bring people together in a geography. How will we know it's successful? Because if we know the success, then we can build it for that success. So people are coming in quickly. Give you a few more moments. So what we're really talking about here is these are the 5 areas that we heard from the survey we did, from the workshops that we did. I put the other in there because maybe there's something else that you're looking at that you would track that would make success. Maybe there's an additional piece that gets beyond, say, for example, the local advocacy, or gets beyond retention or growth or volunteerism or engagement. Maybe, I mean, one of the things that folks have sort of put out there a little bit is this notion of next generation. Some people said that, you know, in other words, if this would increase the diversity of the people that are involved. So I don't see anybody saying other. Let me end the polling so we can get a few more folks to jump in. All right. So The big thing that you guys said was member engagement, followed by member retention, then growth, the development, and a very small of you said around advocacy. Well, the reality is we have to make this decision about how we're going to measure success in order for us to build it. And I would suggest to you that all 5 of these things are certainly very legitimate modes. What we need to do is to bake in, if member engagement, as many of you said is one of the most important ones, then the real question we have is, how are you going to measure that member engagement, right? And on top of measuring that member engagement, how are you going to help support that? So just like the person who, and I forget who it was, who put in there the online community, and you had 1%. So member engagement would mean that you've got members that would be coming to that virtual community. They would be chatting, they'd be responding, they'd be participating, they'd be sharing. And if they're not, what are you able, willing from a resource, a time perspective to be able to drive that member engagement success? This is the reason why we ask this question, is because if success is member engagement, then we have to make sure we build in the system that allows member engagement. And I will tell you, we have a slide coming up, that having volunteers, a robust volunteer role, is going to be key to how you drive that member engagement. What I want to do is share with you a couple of case studies. I think we learn from each other best when we have stories. And we share those stories in a way that allows us to have some learning. So we've had some conversations with a number of organizations, and we asked them in each case for their key takeaways. And I think in many cases, the stories are most instructive for their key takeaways. Let's start with NIGP, the Institute for Public Procurement. Now, I got to ask the question. I didn't go back and look at the participant list, but if Jennifer from NIGP is on here, please let us know, type in, okay? And when you type in, if we get anything wrong, correct us, please. So what I love about the story about NIGP is it's a member-driven association following the needs of the members. That's the cool thing from this. It's the Alaska-Hawaii chapter. This story begins with a longtime, very engaged member moving to Hawaii, not having a chapter, understanding the value of getting together people who are in the same geographic space. He asked the question simply, can we build something else that would work? Can we build a virtual chapter? Interestingly, in the conversation of this, discovered that one of the big issues in a government procurement is you find something, you procure it, but you got to ship it. And Hawaii has some very different needs, concerns, maybe challenges, maybe opportunities in that as one issue. It turns out the folks in Alaska have very similar. So ultimately, this became the Hawaii-Alaska because you had two geographic territories that had something in common, and they wanted to be able to have that connection. Now, they also had in common, Hawaii is huge, Alaska is fairly large, and the density is very sparse. So getting together, island hopping is not going to be the most efficient thing. So raised his hand, got a collection of folks together, had a great conversation, and launched it, and it has been growing, and it has been an engaging community. Couple of the ways that they helped make it engaged. They did, NIGP provides seed money to chapters for startup. They recognized that because this was a unique situation, that they needed to be a little bit more generous. So they did provide some additional seed money. They really wanted to make sure, because the visual web presence was going to be absolutely critical before they could ever even start collecting dues. They really needed to be able to do that. So, and one of the things you might find is when you're starting up your virtual chapter, do you need to think in terms of how are you going to provide seed money or support for this. What was really cool was that they really embraced the community of chapters to help. A couple of people have talked to us about how the on the ground chapters feel a little bit of, right? Well, in this particular case, because it was set up very similarly, obligations and responsibilities to their traditional chapters, the other chapters embrace this new chapter as a startup, and the Rocky Mountain chapter in particular walked them through how do you handle, they had done virtual meetings, how do you handle virtual meeting and video conferencing. So really creating that kind of a synergy. Central Florida came to the rescue with a bunch of templates and things like that. So also helped not only the training and the mentoring from Rocky Mountain, but the Central Florida. The key takeaways from them were to be sure, and I love this one that came from Jennifer, was be absolutely certain that you're clear about the mission and the purpose of this, because for this particular group, their mission and purpose was going to be to solve a unique problem for the members in these two very kinds of almost remote areas. And the goal wasn't to be exactly like a traditional chapter, but rather to create that connectivity. One of the most important things, this is a new initiative, they said that it was really the leadership by the CEO, Rick Grimm, and its board, which made a tremendous difference because, and listen guys, it's a lift. This is not a build it and they will come. It's just like your online community. You can't just put it up there and hope somebody finds it. And you're going to hear this again and again. If it weren't for the volunteer champion, there would be no success. The original champion has mentored folks. He's got members that are coming in, and finally felt like it was, you want to build this as a peer to the chapters, not as a competitor to your other chapters. And we'll have another conversation about that in just a moment. Let's move on though to the International Society of Performance Improvement. Very different, excuse me, scenario where you had a woman who was actually, the virtual chapter really came out of a volunteer leader on the board who in her day job does online learning education and has created virtual chapters. She graduated from Capella University and helped to create their virtual chapter of alumni because it's a virtual university virtual chapter. What they were trying to do was to get a group together in Richmond, Virginia. And the catalyst for the Richmond, Virginia is that one of the things that ISPI does is they have a really, really robust community service project where they go in, it's performance improvement, where they go in and they help a nonprofit that is struggling by applying all of the principles, all of the processes, all of the training to help an organization be more effective, and it's volunteer driven. So this is a project that requires some feet on the, feet on the street. So I have to get in there to work with this nonprofit, but a whole bunch of it can be handled virtually. But you have to have people that know the territory, that know and then they can get there face to face. So it's tailor-made for people in a shared geographic area that don't have space, that don't have time and energy to have a full chapter. They can work on this project, which is it could be 12 months, 18, 24, 36 months. So it's a compelling reason for us to stay together in a conversation, but it's more like kind of like a work group. So one of the things when we talked about this whole conversation was this, Rose said was one of the most important things that the support that made a difference was really helping chapters consider and use live streaming technology. They have a super detailed handbook on community service projects because this was a driver for this process. And so really wanted to be able to say to folks, this is how you do it. So get real clear on that. And the third support given takes it a little bit off the beaten path because the second part of her story is Tennessee. So Richmond is a virtual chapter at this point. Tennessee was a chapter that was struggling a little bit. And the encouragement translated to that group as an encourage to adopt a blended approach to help them be able to bring technology in to extend their reach, right? So the cool thing about this is that what came out of this conversation with Rose was she was saying it's not really so much a virtual chapter, it's really about a hybrid chapter. If you've got a shared geographic space and folks want to get together, but they can't muster the big responsibilities and operations of a chapter, can a hybrid chapter become that technology applied to a geographic face-to-face? And she said that in Tennessee, it's made a tremendous difference and has turned them around. She also told the story of the other chapter, I won't mention, who was in the Midwest and who said, nah, we don't need that technology. In the same time, so they were up here and Tennessee was here, and the balance has shifted. Tennessee has grown stronger by blended approach. The other one has fallen down a little bit. So, interesting key takeaways from this person. Number one, what made the virtual chapter of Richmond work is embedding learning. People are doing something, they're learning, they're gaining something not available in their day job. The blended approach allows you to have that wonderful virtual option to eliminate some of the face-to-face. But very importantly, now you notice, in story number one, the bottom bullet was volunteer. Story number two, every success has a gardener. You need a gardener. You need a gardener who's going to constantly reseed, who's going to jazz it up. And Rose went one more step further, and she said, a true gardener constantly has things going on. They're planting over here, then this comes out. I had a friend who did this amazing job where she had every season there was something in bloom. It's a sensory experience. And it is important for the gardener of a virtual community or a chapter to create that sensory experience that's available in face-to-face. That's how you're going to build the community. And she has seen that firsthand in her alumni group. She's seen that with the Richmond group. She's seen that in the hybrid group, is creating that sensory. All right, let's move on to number three, which is NAPO, the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals. So theirs is a little different. They have a completely, their chapter is completely separate. They've got, they are, hang on one second while I take a real quick drink of water here. I love talking with you all, but I need to refresh my water a little bit. There we go. All right. What you need to know is the virtual chapter started in about 2012, 2013. It was intended to provide an additional option for members. It was structured exactly as a geographic, same policies, affiliate agreement, bylaws. They were set up to have a member login, and they do a lot with webinars. They also have a really cool virtual book club. They have they've got a little bit of conversation and discussion, webinars, and the book club. They are operated by a volunteer full board. I mean, they have the virtual, the webinar committee and the discussion committee and all those committees. They have been able to refresh folks in their pipeline. And what they've heard is that it's easier to generate engagement and volunteerism in the virtual than it is in the traditional. They do, like the other chapters, they have a chapter dues, and they have initiation fee. One of the interesting things is that this is not a required membership, so that folks can opt in. Now, I will tell you that a couple of things came out of this conversation. First and foremost is that it's an independent chapter. They don't have access to data. She's going by what she hears, not absolutely certain how deep the engagement is. Looks like there is engagement though, for sure. But it says it has all the same value, but really, as she was saying to me, it has all the same value, but not the same cost structure. So that's a good thing, right? So we can provide value. A chapter can provide values with less money. But the reality is, in a situation where you have a membership dynamic where it's not required, and I can be a local member over here, a local member there, it has created, set up some competition. And that competition that has been set up is a good news, bad news thing. It's competition for the organization, and it's competition for the other chapters. One of the interesting things is that one of their big benefits of membership is a license and access point to archived annual conference, which is invaluable for CEs. And chapters are allowed to buy a license and allow members to have that access. So it's kind of a really cool, member add-on value. So if you're following me, I'm a chapter. I can buy that license and I can provide it to my members, so they don't buy it from me. So National loses a little bit of money, but as she said, gains happy people and presents themselves as a really great knowledge resource. Well, the virtual chapter can do the same thing, and their dues are less, and so people that are looking at that as a giveaway are, of course, looking at the virtual chapter as an answer. So a couple of support services, chapter resources, all chapters were eligible, so they got it, as well as the license to library, which is the most key value. Their groups are incorporated and all get insurance and tax filing, including the virtual one. So the chapters get access to D&O, general liability, and they're part of the group, and then they're part of the group 990. So in this particular case, the virtual is just exactly like a geographic. But here are the key takeaways. There is that potential competition. What's valuable about National is the virtual, is what's valuable at the virtual chapter. It serves members though, and that's one thing she kept saying over and over again. Not sure she kept saying, not sure how involved they are. Lots of data points I'm not sure about, but I am sure that it's providing another way to connect, and it's driving engagement. And so maybe there's a balance that we have to get there, but it's something worth doing. The other key takeaway is before you can make a decision of how much or how little, you have to have shared data on engagement and metrics to measure. You have to be able to answer the value proposition. And of course, their virtual chapter is completely volunteer driven. And because it's completely volunteer driven, a key takeaway that we didn't mention here, but is really clear for you to know, it's about the volunteers. It's about the volunteers. All right, fourth and final. We're running through these because I think they give you a little bit of a look at some very different things. And this one is, again, very different. It's the Alliance of Hazardous Materials Professionals. And again, I don't know if we've got anybody on here from, if Chip Deal's on or not, but let me share a little bit about what he shared with us. Okay, so it was started by a member with a nod by the association. This member that started their virtual chapter is actually also on the board, so a very involved member, somebody who had been involved in online discussions. He saw the value of that, felt like this is a sort of like NAPOS, that this would provide an outlet for members who don't have a geographic chapter. The interesting thing about this is, again, the metrics are a little limited, but it in and of itself can become a little bit of a competition, right? It can still become a little bit of a competition to the chapters and to the organization. Now, because it is set up like the brick and mortar chapters, we have a non-contingent membership. It is a competitor for membership because I can come into this group. The question though is the value proposition. And one of the things that we talked about as I talked with Chip here is that virtual sometimes becomes an easy replacement when there's weakness in the value proposition, or there's not a full understanding of the value proposition. Because if I don't see why I'm paying dues for this stuff that I'm not seeing, and I can go over here and hop in and out of a community discussion when I need it, I'm going to opt for that. So one of the key takeaways I got from that conversation from Chip is you get a member who's very excited, you open this up, understand what the competition is, but understand that that's not going to solve. This is not going to solve a weak or a unclear value proposition. And the support that they gave him is, basically they just said yes to the member. So the cool thing here is they said yes to a member, and we really ought to listen to our members, right? So let me pause for a moment because I see a question come up here. How often are these virtual chapter meetings, and how many our members are participating at the same time? Cindy, that is quite frankly an awesome question. And they, across the system here, they're very different. So the one with the most activity is the NAPO one, because they have the virtual book clubs as well as the webinars. And then, for the most part, they're trying to do something every month, every other month-ish. Most of the other ones are just doing it quarterly or 3 times a year in terms of some kind of an event. In terms of how many members are participating, that's the missing data point. They know that in Hawaii, Alaska, they're getting a deep engagement because there was really nothing there, and they really built their network. And what I understand is that a large percentage of their members are actually coming on and getting engaged in those webinars. We don't have real clear data on the other folks, on any of these other 3 stories to say to you. I'm going to take that back in just one moment because I'll tell you about ISPI in just a moment. In these other 2 here, there is missing data points in terms of how many people are getting engaged. So great question. And it seems like this is one of those cases that if you're going to understand what the metric is, you have to have something to measure. But frequency, it seems like the frequency of the events that these groups are doing tends to be quarterly or 3 times or 2 times a year versus what many on the ground folks are doing, which is every other month or monthly. So there is a little bit less frequency, but that is offset by the fact that there is a discussion. But many of these discussion boards are not any more vibrant, are not more vibrant than online communities for the most part. Collaborates with the brick and mortar chapters. What I like about this story, and what I was just talking about, it's sort of like an IGP. What I mean by that is that one of the really cool things here is that this one is collaborating with the brick and mortar. So they're saying, if we're doing a webinar and your folks are interested, let's open it up, let's bring more folks in. They are also doing some streaming of their webinars so that brick and mortar can have a virtual opportunity. Now, one might say, couldn't National be doing it that way? And I would say, absolutely. But maybe National has such a firm production schedule that having a virtual chapter that is offering this collaboration with the brick and mortar would be good. So the collaboration goes both ways. If I'm a virtual chapter member and I'm going to be local, I can get the local member rate for being in the local chapter. So that was, I think that was really cool, was again building this community. We saw that with NIGP. Both of these groups are building that community of chapter leaders. And one of the things I want to mention is that they really are trying to take a look at the membership sequence, and we'll have to get back with them to find out how this does, but they're considering a dual membership offer and playing with it at the virtual chapter level at some level. All right. But Chip is, I don't know how many of you know Chip Deal. So Chip has been a CEO. He's been an old chapter guy. A CRP is where his roots were with CFA Institute and with FEI and a number of other folks. So I was really anxious to see the key takeaways from him, and because he thinks like a CRP CEO. So it's member-driven, limited staff involvement. When that happens, there's brand alignment and experience and consistencies. So he's suggesting having a member that's active and interested and engaged is excellent, but the problem is going to be that you have to make sure that the staff is involved. So these chapters are not going to have less staff involvement. Be mindful of the fact that virtual is a different membership category and non-contingent can be viewed as competition, but it can also bring in non-members. And it is as he said, one of the things he's learned is that this particular chapter is, in his mind, the strongest, most active of the chapters when he looks at the number of people who have joined, and there are people who have joined that and a geographic chapter. So he thinks that there's something to be learned from this and that there may be an opportunity for us to use virtual chapters as part of that. And again, it's the chapter-to-chapter sharing is going to be critical. So one of the questions in all three of these comes at, so what are we offering? What's being offered in these virtual sections or these virtual services? And largely what we're seeing is the predominant thing is some kind of a virtual education, a webinar, or a virtual coffee chat, or a virtual panel discussion. That's the most common one. But you did see things like in NAPO were book clubs, so where they had they all read a book and then they had an online discussion. So we have seen that. The other thing we're seeing is mentoring, virtual mentoring, peer-to-peer, senior to newbie, all different kinds of mentoring options, but mentoring being the other one. And then of course the standard is just having the document library and the ability to have a conversation, which is why we keep saying if there's nothing else going on, all of those elements really are in the domain of your online community. So it still is going to come back to, is there a reason that we should have a virtual chapter that is unique from our online community? Thank you for that question, because it absolutely helps us take a look at a critical question of, do we need a virtual chapter, or is our online community our virtual chapter? Okay, 4 musts. Dealing with blurred lines between online communities, SIGs, it's going to add a confusion if you don't have a clear purpose. So you got to have clear purpose. Secondly, you have to set this up as a partnership, or you're going to have competition. You have to understand that SIGs and chapters have the same issues. They all need volunteer muscle. You still have to train, support the volunteers. We didn't talk to anybody who said these things are just rocking and rolling without volunteers. So you have to have that. And each one of those cases, headquarters support was in many ways a defining experience. It was something that headquarters was doing, whether it was NAPO allowing them to have access to the license, whether it was NIGP giving additional seed money and helping with the platform, whatever it was, it's going to be headquarters support. It's like your online community. You can't just put it there, can't build it and they will come. So here's a few guiding questions, because we had one person raise their hand on the takeaway section of the virtual workshop that we had and said, thank you very much for this day. I now know that I do not need a virtual chapter. What I need to do is go back and reinvest on my online community. So that's why I wanted to give you these guiding questions so you can take a look at it. So let's 3 questions that are starter questions for the why based on what we've heard. And let's take you through some things. So do I have areas where members are that have no chapter? Great. Okay. Is there a gap in services because of that? So is there something missing for that individual? Okay. If yes, is there a new service that focuses on geographic component but doesn't need face-to-face? In other words, if there's a gap in services and there is something that we can do that's virtual, that's specific to the geographic component, then maybe that's going to be the answer. But the question still has to be, is that service going to be offered best virtually? In which case, build. So if there's areas where members have no chapter, but there's no gap in services because you're offering stuff online, it's not necessarily going to be an answer for you. Okay, do I have chapters that are struggling or dying? Yep. and there is a gap in services. We start back to, is there a gap in services? Okay, if there's a gap in services, once again, is there a new service that focuses on the geographic component? Is it best offered virtually? If so, let's build. So if you are adding this as a structure to provide something that's best offered virtually, focused on geographic area, certainly. And the third question we have, is there a constituency underserved in a chapter area? So because of location proximity, because of member type, because of professional needs. So the example of the military virtual chapter was there was a military base, but they really couldn't participate in the conversations that were happening in the area because they had military conversation. Okay. So if there's a service that will focus on that component and it can be offered virtually, let's build it. Let me go back to that page. So I think as you are considering, you're saying, is a virtual chapter the answer? You have to ask it in the same context of, is my online community already answering it? Are my SIGs already answering it? No, because it's got a geographic tie that needs to be answered. And that geographic tie, i.e., the ISPI virtual chapter in Richmond around the community service project, which is a real give back for members. They love that. And it's got to be done on the ground, but can also be done virtually. That is an answer for each of these. All right. Let's do one. We've got a couple of minutes here. Let's talk about the key components. Let's say all of those said yes, and we need to know what we're going to put this in. All right. There are undeniably 4 key components. I'm going to start with volunteers because we heard it, and we heard it. In all 4 of these cases, you have to have volunteers. And for the most part, the volunteers are going to need help around how do I use this technology? How do I engage members? How do I drive conversation? How do I market what we're trying to do? How do I understand members' needs? Like they're going to need all those same things. In addition to that, they're probably going to need additional support and training around the nuances of an online community, because on the ground chapters can get people in a room and we can have a conversation, but virtual chapters are never going to be in a room. So we need to teach them all the good principles about online community, which is going to be a little add-on. So you need volunteers, absolutely. They're going to drive it, and we need to support them. The key component, obviously, again, is member engagement. The question we have here is, what type of engagement do you expect? Now, I love that, Rachel, you had asked, okay, well, what resources are being offered beyond live streaming events? And that gets at, well, what type of engagement do you want? If you want learning, then you have to be able to provide opportunities for people to learn. Now, one of the interesting things, I was talking with someone earlier, and we were talking about, she was saying it was a chapter officer out of Georgia for another organization, and she said to me, you know, it's all well and good. We've done some live streaming events, she said, but for the people not in the room, they need some extra care and feeding. No one wants to sit and watch a webinar. They want to be involved and engaged. And how do we bake that into our program? Technology is obviously critical. You can't do this with poor technology. You have to have an online community. You really should have something that allows single sign-on. If you're going to allow yourself to do the metrics, the technology would best be harnessed or established or hosted by the national organization, because then you can make sure that the component, that it is quality, there's single sign-on, there's a connection, there's a brand alignment. And finally, dues. So if you've got existing chapters, and you don't have dues to be in the virtual chapter, you're going to be in a situation of creating competition, which could be create angst with your other chapters. But then the question is, how much do they need? As with NAPO, they need less money because they're not supporting an operational system as a on the ground chapter. But they should have resources to still potentially bring in speakers. They may have to optimize their technology. They may want to have face-to-face meetups at your national meeting. So a large part of this, and in each of our cases, every one of these chapters has a chapter dues, by the way. In each of those 4 scenarios, they all have chapter dues. And in one case, those chapter dues are less than the on the ground chapters, and the other ones that they're the similar rate. But you will need revenue source. This is not going to be something that's going to be free. And you saw how NIGP brought in the seed money. The folks at NAPO are able to, through that license, they're able to bring in additional people and co-collaborate with some of their chapters. All right. Oops, let me go back for just one moment here. I want to ask you one more poll. I hope so. Assuming that the chat has been really kind of quiet, so I'd love to see if there's other chat. Maybe nobody has any other questions. But go ahead. While you're doing that, let me launch this poll. So we've thrown out some ideas. Maybe even put the question of, so guys, is virtual chapter really the answer for you? So I'm curious. Will you start a virtual chapter, a hybrid chapter? What are you thinking here? I mean, after this conversation, what's going on with you? So Karen's asking why you guys are polling. Do you see successes in developing communities that are based around events like annual conventions? Can they be maintained in the long term? Karen, great question. Love to have some additional people chat in on this. I have seen successes in developing around events. One of the cool examples comes from NIGP. I wish Jennifer was on the call. They create a community around their leadership conference. At least they have in the past number of years. And they create a separate website. And they have some chat, and they put stuff up there. And I've seen a number of organizations do that. So when you think about, and I know that's for chapters, but I'm just saying, creating that around an event really allows people who are focused on that event to be engaged. I've never, in my estimation, and I'd love to see if anybody else has, I've never seen that have a life much beyond a little bit after the event. However, I have seen folks start a community around the, let me share the results while I'm talking here. Start a community around an event and then transition that to a broader use community. In other words, sometimes we can't get people on our online communities, but we can get them involved as part of an event, and then we can pull them over to the online community. So I have seen that. But even as I say that, keep in mind, and one of the things I loved about the blog post in Higher Logic, and I need to pull that link so you guys can look at it, because there's a lot of, there's some interesting data around it. One of the cool things about that is that he looked at 2006 to 2011 and said that rule, that 99-1 versus 70-20-10, has changed in a large part because people are more used to getting their information virtually, getting engaged virtually. They're more comfortable with sharing ideas and building on other people's ideas in a virtual space. So really, I think that that there's a real possibility here for you to see any of the activity go up as we get more folks involved in the online community. All right, running out of time here, folks. I'm sure some people have to drop off. Bye, Melissa. Let me just do a couple of quick closing slides just so you guys are aware of some things that are coming up. We're super excited. Yes, chapters, we're going to do another program, Yes, Chapters Can Drive Growth workshop. It's going to be, there's a slight change. We announced that we were going to be able to do it in 2 locations with a bunch of other things going on. We're going to have a Washington, D.C. Wednesday, July 10th. You can head to this URL and find out more about that. We are going to do, at this point, we are planning to do a live stream portion of it. We'll get more details on that, our own little hybrid. But yes, Chapters Can Drive Growth workshop is going to be another collaborative workshop where we're going to talk about, bring some case studies, but have folks talk about it and build their own plan from that. And of course, CEX. October 18th, Grand Hyatt. Listen, we've already got a baker's dozen of people registered. Last year we sold out. We did add more seats this year. You don't want to miss this fun. All right, guys, you got to get out of here and get back to work. Although I hope that this was useful in your work for you. I want to thank you again for jumping in. I'd love to have you connect with us on the chat box if you see anything else. Rachel, hotel blocks for CEX. I'm gonna check on that and we'll get back to you. I don't know if you know offhand, Sarah, and you can respond to her. We'll check on that for sure. We have a great day set up for you guys already. Listen, it has been absolutely wonderful. Please, you got any questions, you got any thoughts, let us know. As always, it is a pleasure. Thank you from Peggy Hoffman. Thank you from Sarah and Charlotte and Paige and Mark and Peter and the full Mariner Bill Highway team. It's been a pleasure.